Why are there so many coffee processing methods? Today I will explain what is washed coffee, natural and honey, and how it affects the flavor. Let's start from understanding what is coffee processing method. First of all, it's a necessity because coffee is a cherry and our goal is to have clean green coffee bean so we can roast it. And if you've ever peeled an orange, you know that is a lot of work in order to get the seeds out, if you want the seeds, like in our case. So here we have the same issue. We have a lot of work to do in order to get undamaged green coffee bean. That's why we need some processing, but chemistry is not involved. It's all natural. We have a couple of options here. First of all, natural processed. Simplest of all. We just pick the cherry and dry it and then hull it. So we get a clean green coffee bean. But it is quite a risky method because we need a special weather to do that. If it's rainy, obviously it will not dry and it could spoil. That's the reason some countries banned it, because conditions did not allow to do it safely. Next is washed processed, which is most reliable stable but requires water, and not everyone has this luxury. First we remove the skin using a special machine, and then we throw it in water, where it could spend a couple of days, because we need to get rid of pulp, and bacteria will help us with that. In water it will eat it, you will mix the coffee beans and they will be clean after all. And after that, as with every coffee, drying stage. And you can use mechanical dryers. This is the most stable method, and if you don't have proper conditions, it can be used. Why it's more reliable? Because bacteria eats the pulp and there is nothing to spoil, not that much to spoil. Because in natural processed coffee, some cherries may spoil, over ferment, and you probably will not notice this and you will feel it in the cup. And that's why washed processed is the most reliable. Next one is honey processed, and we even have some variations: red, black, yellow, probably white. And it is simple. We just harvest the coffee, put it in the hive, and bees do all of the work. And as the result, we have super sweet and aromatic coffee. Just kidding. It is like washed processed coffee, but not exactly. We don't wash it. We remove some skin and some amount of pulp. Depending on the amount of pulp removed, we have different variations: black, red, etc. And then we put it to dry, preferably in a good climate or special environment, because they have special buildings to dry the coffee. Every method requires enormous amount of work. Like in washed process, you need to mix the coffee, then place it on a patio, etc. So that's a lot of work, and coffee also needs to be rotated because drying should be even. Like you need to rotate it because from the top, yes, sun is drying it, but from the bottom not that much. So you need to have air circulation, etc. And in order to do this better, some even use raised beds, and even more tricky, which is placing it in a shade so that there is no direct sun. So it dries out more evenly and more gradually, which is important for storing, very important. Because if you dry it too fast, crop will not last that long. So now you understand why some countries have only washed processed coffee, mostly washed processed coffee, like Kenya and Burundi, etc. Also, we have very popular thing now, which is anaerobic modulation. Some call it anaerobic fermentation, but it is more like modulation, because we have fermentation in washed process. What it does, it's fermenting. Natural process, it also can be fermented. And there are a lot of different ways to get this anaerobic fermentation, like in some special tanks with carbonic maceration, fermentation with CO2 injection. So we're not going to dig deep, just know that we can add additional flavor. Like you have cucumber and you can have a pickle, and pickle will have more intense flavor, and depending on the amount of time it ferments, it will be different. So different amount of intensity of this acidity added. And if it is done intentionally, it's definitely modulation, because we shift the flavor where we want it to be, and it is an art. Because it requires precision in order to be done perfectly, in both time and temperature. Another variation which you can find is infused coffee. It's not a part of a processing method, but it's also a modulation. And it's not like super fair, but it's somewhat fair. In short, you can throw your coffee beans in some plastic bag, add some fruits, and they will absorb coffee beans some amount of flavor from these fruits. So they will ferment together, flavor will be absorbed by the coffee beans, and because it's like a sponge structure. If it is done correctly, it could be a masterpiece. And Colombia is currently the leader in this, especially coffee nut. Such coffee will be very pronounced and it will be very easy to recognize the flavor, but it's more like a cocktail and it's not everyday coffee, it's like weekend coffee. The look. You can recognize natural processed by the look. It is smooth in color, while washed is quite spotty and textured. But if it is textured and spotty, it can also be a sign of anaerobic modulation as well. Some coffee roasters don't mention that coffee anaerobic, but if you see flavors like pineapple or similar funky in washed coffee, it is a sign that it was fermented. Flavor. Processing methods will dramatically affect the flavor, and some coffee stations have the luxury to choose their preferred coffee processing method because it will allow them to open up the potential of coffee better. Like some coffee is better suited for natural processed, to be natural processed. Some coffee honey, and honey could be different, and that's how they can have even one coffee on the farm, but by having different processing methods on one farm or processing station, they can have a variety of lots from just one coffee, and they will be very different. As for the flavor, washed processed coffee most of the time will be clean and crisp, so there will be high clarity and light body. It could be perceived as thin and have a pretty low intensity, but depends on the roasting. You can expect it to have some berries in flavor, some apricot notes, some flowers, and mostly it will be acidic. Natural processed coffee will have a very rich flavor, very intense and heavy. Like mouthfeel will be pretty heavy. It is usually perceived as more sweet with less acidity, and also it is most of the time easier to perceive the flavors because of higher intensity. And it has most of the time somewhat warm feel to it, and it is perfect for milk beverages. And if you're only starting out with light roast coffee, filter roast coffee, it is better to start from natural process because it will be easier transition to have. Just the sweetness, you will enjoy it. Honey is quite rare, especially good ones, but if you find it, it could be very interesting because added layers of complexity will make it very interesting. Like it's somewhere between washed and natural, but the combination, like it's not too much sweetness, not too much acidity, it's just very complex. And the mouthfeel is very different. As for the brewing, the processing method will affect the bean structure. So usually washed processed coffee is more dense and it is somewhat harder to extract, and it can be sometimes, most of the time, brewed a little bit longer in pour-over especially. So the water will not flow that fast through the coffee. But for some delicate coffee, you still need to brew it a little bit faster. So for me personally, there is no rule like for brewing natural washed and honey coffee. I just brew it as coffee wants. Like I don't have preset for some coffee except anaerobic. Overall, natural and anaerobic has more like porous coffee structure and it is easier to extract. That's why usually you will need to brew it faster. Otherwise, you may have some dark flavors which will be unpleasant, and especially be careful with water temperature here because of this porous structure and chemical compounds. You can extract some unpleasant ones if you're going too high. Like I brew in all of the coffee with 90 degrees Celsius and it's totally fine and working for all of the coffee. So to wrap up, the coffee processing methods are different first of all because of the conditions where coffee is grown. So do they have space for huge facility in order to process the coffee, and in what ways they can process it. Do they have water, labor, etc.? And do they need some special processing method? And this gives you a lot of options in terms of the flavor. So you can use like some one origin and try different processing methods. Like this is Kenyan natural processed coffee, which is rare, but it's very interesting because usually you expect some berries from Kenyan coffee most of the time. Here it's even wine and jam and some compote. So overall the video is pretty useless, but now at least you know what to expect from each coffee processing method. Thanks for watching, see ya.